Bend is a timber town. You wouldn't know it to look at it today. The timber qualities are almost completely removed, but yes, Bend was a timber town to begin with. The pine forests of Deschutes County were estimated at 26 billion board feet as the potential timber that could be harvested here. It was not a small thing, and so when the first pioneer homesteaders come to town, a whole lot of them all start their own small family mills. So you'd start your homestead and you'd have a small mill that as you're logging things and getting stuff set up to be agricultural, you're also making a side income selling lumber locally. But the larger scheme of things, there were several large mill operations in the Midwest, in Minnesota, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, that all had their eyes on this forest here in Central Oregon. But there was no rail line, so even if you got to the trees and got them cut, how would you get them to market? So they had all been buying up timber rights and sections of property that had timber stands on them, but not acting on them. And it wasn't until the railroad came in 1911. That's the watershed moment for our history. And so construction starts, plans are made, and the large mills are built. The two primary mills on the banks of the Deschutes were Shevlin-Hixon and Brooks-Scanlon. Both of them had come out from Minneapolis, Minnesota. They were both family operations. The Brooks family was, I think, 4 or 5 sons. So they had been well established in the Midwest, and they were out of trees in the Midwest. So that was why they had their eyes set over here, and just in some cases picked up and moved, whole operations here. And a lot of loyal employees came with them. So they start cutting in 1916, and by 1920, 1921, they're the two largest pine mill operations in the world. Each of the mills had about 600 men working on site. They had twice as many working out in the forest as loggers. So it was enormous. It went from small family operated, handful of men running small mills to enormous industry-sized milling operations within a span of just 10, 15 years. A lot of the workforce in both Brooks-Scanlon and Shevlin-Hixon were from 2 immigrant pools. One were Scandinavian families that had come from the Midwest to Bend, a lot of them following the company that they'd already worked for years. But there was also a group from Eastern Europe. There's a large Slavic population that moves here. Also, part of that is attributable to World War I. Europe is in chaos and at war. What better thing to do than to leave and go to the dream of America? And so you get a large Slavic population moving in and getting jobs in the mill. But there is a third area that were homesteaders who had gone bust. So in addition to 1900 to 1920 being a huge boom time here for lumber, it's also the last gasp of homesteading of the West. I think one of the things that differentiates the logging industry here at the moment in time that we developed these 2 mills was the international scene. 1916, it's World War I. So one of the first products generated at the mills were ammunition boxes. Both mills had box factories, and they were largely staffed by women employees in the beginning because it was World War I. So that was feeding an international need for timber, not just during the war, but then during the rebuilding years immediately following the war. So those pressures on the need for timber and building supplies really inflamed the market and put a high demand right at the time period when these forests were being opened. At the height of the timber industry, so if you were to drop into Bend in, say, 1928, you would have smelled the mills, you would have smelled sawdust. If you went through certain parts of town, you'd get sawdust on your clothes. You would hear periodic mill whistles from the 2 gigantic super mills that were on the banks of the Deschutes River. It would have permeated everything. It would have been 10 minutes off from the downtown core where all the shops were, but you would have seen the smoke from the smokestacks and the burners. You would have smelled it, you would have heard the whistles. You would have known right away that you were in the middle of Timbertown, USA. The other really fascinating thing for me as a historian looking at these two mill companies is you think logging, it's a mill, and you think loggers and all of that. But they had a whole nother side of their companies, which was their own railroads. In the Pacific Northwest and here as well, there was this phenomenon that was called railroad logging. And so what you did was the company built rail lines out into the forest, straight from the mills to the trees, and had these little mobile communities of loggers that went with them. So you would just build your rail line out, got to where you wanted to set up, take off all the buildings off of the flat cars, move your little logging camp village there. Everyone would go out from there, log, the trees go onto the rail lines, come into the mills. So not only did they build, multiple buildings that had active saws and the big green chains that come up off of the river and pull the logs up, you had railroads circling in all around that area and going out, spidering out of the city into the forests surrounding it. We're at the Deschutes Historical Museum, and this is our forest industry exhibit room where we cover the history of small mills, the Brooks-Scanlon, Shevlin-Hixon large mills, as well as the Forest Service histories of Deschutes County. There's lots of different implements and things needed for a whole 100 years of logging history. It's not just the early pieces, but later pieces that were developed as well. And some very inventive things, like this is one of my favorites. It's a drag saw. It was designed to be able to help cut up firewood. It weighs over 250 pounds. It's a whopping 4 horsepower gasoline engine that would turn and turn and turn and run that blade that runs lengthways over there. So the idea is with the wheel on the front, it's kind of like a wheelbarrow, that you could pull it up to a fallen log and have it saw off sections that could then be burned in a boiler or whatever you needed firewood for. This would have been used about the 1920s. Throughout the 100 years of logging history here, we see a shift from horsepower and drag saws to brand new large Caterpillar, large equipment out in the forest. But that also meant that you shifted from things like two-man hand saws taking down trees to chainsaws. And included in that, this front piece here from 1947 is a two-man chainsaw that would be out in the forest falling trees. It weighs about 120 pounds. The scary thing about this in the industrial safety category, this didn't have what was called a float carburetor on it. So you couldn't turn it or the chainsaw would die. So what turned instead was the blade itself. So as you approached the tree, your fellow worker on one end, you on the other, you could turn the blade and then saw off the tree and then turn it back right side up. So you get a variation of 1940s era chainsaws in this part of the museum. This is one of my favorite photographs in the museum collection. It details one of the Shevlin-Hixon company camps about 1920, and you really get a sense of the scope of these logging camps. So on either edge of the panoramic, you can see the rail line coming in, and then you just see the haphazard, in this shot it feels haphazard, of the logging camp cars as they've been placed off and grouped accordingly. You see the occasional car, you see the outhouses. There's a grouping of gentlemen right here posing for the photograph. I think this is the top of the ladder that the photographer has taken to get up to his platform to be able to take this shot. But as you look, you see family houses, houses that have built a little root cellar off to the side to be able to keep their groceries fresh. So you really get a sense of this little mobile village that would have been picked up and moved down the line, and all of the pieces left behind them when they moved to the next spot. There's great stories about the post office being really mad that they would show up to deliver 2 months worth of mail in bags, and the camp would have moved again and been gone, and they would have had to have started all over to find where they had gone. For all the timber holdings that Brooks-Scanlon and Shevlin-Hixon had acquired before opening the mills, They had logged all of their available timber in the first 8 years that they were open. And at that point, they start talking to the then relatively new U.S. Forest Service that had established the Deschutes National Forest here almost concurrently to the mills picking up their timber operations. The Forest Service knew they were cutting at unsustainable rates. It's not something that was hidden. If you go through Forest Service archives, you can see clearly that they knew it wasn't sustainable, the percentage of the lumber board feet that they were cutting. Both of the mills were set up to cut at maximum capacity between 400 million and 600 million board feet a year. So they were really churning it out. And it's 1950 when it kind of comes to a head. Shevlin-Hixon at that point closes. There were lots of things that went into that, including the death of the head of the company, but by 1950 it was clear to all involved that the forests could no longer sustain two enormous super mill companies on the banks of the Deschutes, and so the Shevlin-Hixon mill closes and sells out to Brooks-Scanlon. From 1950 to 2000, you just get this really slow decline in the timber industry here. Smaller mills, like near Prineville, those could keep going north to Madras. There was enough trees to keep smaller mill outfits going. The scope and size that Brooks-Scanlon and Shevlin-Hixon had grown to simply weren't sustainable by the forest. Brooks-Scanlon stays in operation until the late 80s, and 1990 is when they finally shut down the milling operations for good. At that point, it's been coming for so long that it's not a surprise, but it's still really a hard thing for the community to absorb. And it takes a while to lose that. But tourism and recreation and just the housing industry is what replaced that for our local economy. Today, you can go and shop where the mills once stood. You can go stand inside the old powerhouse for Mill A, but it's an REI, which is kind of fun. And for me, it's this great blend of the two different things that the forest has provided for the economy here. Up above you, you see the smokestacks, and you go inside and there's this huge beam that still says Brooks-Scanlon on it. And that's the mill history. And then you look around and it's all the equipment and gear that you need for going out camping and enjoying the forest. So it's this great mixture of lumber history and recreational history all under this one historic roof.